All right, we are live. Nice, nice. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here today with someone who I haven't spoken with for some time, although we've been talking a lot on Discord. I'm here with the Pakistani Reactionary. How you doing, my dude?
I'm doing well, man. Thanks for having me on.
No problem, no problem. I really wanted to have you on because I think the last conversation we had was very fun, and
hmm
on top of that, I've kind of changed a lot of my opinions on things. I've kind of come
Yeah.
around to what would be ostensibly your view of things. So I think we can
hmm
start with that first.
Yeah. So, what'd you have in mind?
Well, I think the big thing that I was kind of advocating for in my last conversation with you was sort of a cultural free market, is how I'm going to put it,
hmm
which essentially amounted to the idea that, oh, because the free market is preferable, people are naturally going to kind of meander towards it because all cultures will eventually see that all cultures are eventually going to do what's best for them, and the free market is best for everybody. So they're all just going to slowly towards move
Yeah.
towards that. But uh, that ain't the case.
Yeah. Figure that out.
Mm.
That's what's up, man. It's good
um,
to see you're evolving, and I've evolved my opinions as well. So, it's a mutual just journey of just learning more and understanding more, and just figuring out how the world works better.
mm. Yeah, one of the big things for me was that I really sort of under appreciated. At the time, we were both on the same page that this whole kind of autistic Lulbert thing that collectives are only artificial constructs created by mistake
hmm
was like ridiculous. But I at that time I don't think I fully appreciated the extent to which tribal influences still play like a major role in like deciding really simple stuff that on all political issues, and it just takes primacy, and I didn't really appreciate that at the
hmm
time.
Well, it's funny that you mentioned like the autistic thing. It's like a little jab we use for the libertarians, but like a big thing in humans is that they're geared towards spirituality, and I don't mean spirituality in like the mystic sense, but I mean in like the sense of being connected with others and being connected with something greater than yourself. And you see these in a lot of non-autistic people. They strive for meaning and belonging and all sorts of other things, and they will pursue these at great personal loss to themselves and other spheres. So, um,
Mm.
and one of the problems with well, it's correct to label these sort of like super what we call autistic libertarian arguments as autistic because autistic people, they lack that sort of empathy and ability to connect with people outside of them, so they really lack that sense of spirituality and connectedness to something which is greater than and exterior to themselves.
Mm. Yeah, and I think that's certainly one of the failings of libertarian philosophy, of basic bitch Lulbert philosophy in
Mm-hmm.
general, in that it's really sort of this it's really like the stereotypical Murray Rothbard ghetto ethics type of deal, where
Yeah.
it's the complete refusal to acknowledge that the commons exists, and that there is a greater good to be served beyond like individual hedonism and things
Mm-hmm.
like that. And even the fact that that hedonism in some case can damage the value of the commons or even your own property in general, because like if I live
Yeah.
next to a crack house, the value of my own house is going to be going down, so it's like it's hurting my
Yeah.
assets as well.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly the case. And yeah, it's really kind of like a intellectual maturing because I used to be exact same, just for the audience's sake, I used to be the exact same sort of like very Rothbardian. I first got into Rothbard back in 2014, I believe. I ordered his book For a New Liberty, and I just read through that and read through a bunch of his stuff. I read through like some Ron Paul stuff a little bit, read through all that, and then once I was like, holy shit! But I mean, I was younger then, and so as I've just read more about politics and been more involved in the day to day of following what's going on politically, following what's going on in the foreign policy sphere, and in all sorts of these domestic and foreign spheres. I was able to learn that the model of reality that I had that was influenced by Murray Rothbard and those type of libertarians, it did not it did not hold up against what I was experiencing. So eventually what I had to do was just kind of like scrap my model and just kind of like start anew and try to find other models of describing the world, because at the end of the day, that's what models are. Like we create models, statistical models or financial models, so that we can have predictive power towards the future. So that we can have a general idea of, based on these characteristics, based on these variables, based on how these variables interact, if I input this, this is what will come out. And so, when you have the same thing comes with a political, more like an ontological model. You need it for sort of predictive power, so that how you can kind of predict how things will turn out when you do certain things. And so, if I sit here and say, everyone's an individual and they're 100% rational agents and they're all this thing, like if I use that as my ontology and I try to go do anything in the world, I'm not gonna get very far. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, and I think, in regards to what we had to reshape, we obviously had to reshape our view from like the idea that everybody is just purely an individual and that collectives are just, kind of these socially coerced things that don't really exist. And I think it was probably easier for you to do so than me, only because you come from a group of people who are much more ethnically and racially conscious than I am. Like, white people have been taught to totally disregard race as, a basis on which to vote or on a basis which to, consider just the most basic facet of their identity. We're taught to totally disregard that. But I imagine in a Pakistani community, it's much different.
Well, even the Pakistani social structure is very different. So it's very family based. So I remember when my parents first came here and when I was growing up, like we would see just the type of the dynamic between parent and child was very different. This doesn't always happen, but you get that kind of like stereotype of, oh, your kid turns 18, it's time for him to move out and get a house or get a job or something like that. That's not how Pakistanis are at all. It's like it's very foreign for them. But also like the kind of like individualism that the Anglos have it's very conducive to a high trust polity. And when you have like a bunch of white people having that in a country, that's a very big advantage for you, because you trust others like they are yourself. You don't necessarily have this sort of preset loyalty to your family or whatever. Oh, of course you have loyalty, but it's not as extreme. You have less of that. So it's more conducive towards a high trust, low transaction cost polity than you would get with a more collectivist culture. And more collectivist cultures, they usually require greater authority to manage them and to operate them, which is why you'll see places like China, which are one-party states. But I mean, it works for them. They are progressing quite nicely.
Yeah, that's something, that's something we can certainly view consistently, because you look at the nations like Japan and China that had sealed themselves off because they were so far ahead of everyone else for a certain period of time, and they ended up falling behind. Japan was able to make the stride.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that real quick? You cut out.
Oh yeah, no, I was just talking about how nations like Japan, who had cut themselves off for like half a century, and then fell behind like the cultural and economic trend of development, were able to essentially right themselves within a half a century as well, because they are just a culturally homogenous and unified force, especially on Japan. Like who was it? I think it was like Commodore Matthew Perry from America went over to like force Japan to open up trade, and they realized at that point they were so far behind the game, but they modernized in 40 years, and that's something that you might call it is necessarily kind of a collective action that you won't see the acknowledgement of from like libertarians, or basic bitch libertarians at least, and certain types of other people.
Well, but on the other hand, with collectivist cultures, you have also some benefits in another sphere. So during the Meiji Restoration, that Admiral Perry, I believe his name was, after we went on, the way they're very feudalist, they were feudalist, and so they are able to adapt as a society very quickly. So one example kind of customary in Japan that when there's a recession, they don't fire employees, but rather they will take a pay cut. So they try to retain as many workers as possible, but all the workers, they collectively bear the cost of the recession. They collectively bear that, and so they'll all take some pay cuts so that, but they'll still keep their job, and that's through their just like very like feudal history and feudal identity. It influences the economic sphere, and I mean, I would say that's a pretty cool thing that Japan does. I personally would like to see more behaviors like that in the U.S., but U.S. is different culturally.
Yeah, definitely. You're right. That's that's a very smart example of something where is cultural collective action that, I don't think even libertarians would necessarily disagree with, because it's something sort of the society itself has consented to or learned to at least accept over hundreds and hundreds of years. And so it's not like it's being forced upon people. It's just the culture, and it's just this a homogeneity that you won't get here because we are so ethnically and culturally fractured. Now, I think the other part of it is that one of the big reasons that Anglos kind of developed this individualist streak that sort of developed into the parasitism.
I'm sorry, you cut out again.
Oh, one of the reasons that Anglos, I think, developed this individualist streak that kind of developed into the parasitism of Murray Rothbard's ghetto ethics is that we've always had a high discount on defense because, we've just come from an island and stuff like that. And I think that's part of what other cultures have had to deal with. Like, other cultures have had to be far more collectivized and have maintained a much more homogenous collective identity because it was necessary for them to survive at the time, and it just has carried over till now. Meanwhile, with Anglos, it wasn't necessary because you had the high discount on defense because you had splendid isolation, and from there we were just able to become a dominant power. And in that then carries over to the subsequent nations that were previously their colonies.
Yeah. Well, the interesting thing about Murray Rothbard, it's pivoted off of John Locke. And what's interesting about Rothbard's work is that he was, to my knowledge, he is one of the first people to approach liberalism from a secular end. I'm sure there probably was someone before him, but in my reading, so when you read John Locke in his two treatises of government, he is responding to a book or essay by Sir Robert Filmer, who was a supporter of divine right monarchy. And so Sir Robert Filmer, he derived divine right monarchy from the privileges and etc. that God gave Adam. And so as the first man and husband, and he had absolute authority over his wife and children. That's what Sir Robert Filmer claimed. But what John Locke said was actually in the Bible, it was more like this. So the entire debate around what we know as liberalism is John Locke is completely Christian-centric. And so one of the things which I had before thought of was strange was that a lot of liberals, they will say, oh, this is immoral or this is wrong. And I'm like, well, wrong according to who? Every sort of judgment needs a person to refer to. So when I say what you're doing here is illegal, what I'm referring to is that this is against the code established by the federal government and you're answerable to them. But in this sort of this secular liberalism, they didn't have this referent, or they didn't have this person they would point to when they, his authority is wrong. But in the original sense of liberalism, it was God. That was who they were referring to, and they formulated their morality and all these sorts of things after God, after the Bible. And so Rothbard, he takes that, he stripped religion out of it, and he's like, oh no, what you answer to now is your self-ownership. And so what you're answering to now is it's the right thing based on your self-ownership, and you derive all this shit. Whereas Lockean tradition and even the divine right kings, those philosophers, it was all based on the Bible. And so what Rothbard did was he took out all the Christianity from it, inserted this weird sort of oh, I'm a self-owner and that means something, and he inserted that, and he just completely secularized liberalism in the libertarian sphere, and I'm just like, there's just, and so when we had this discussion of libertarianism as a negative doctrine, well, its predecessor, liberalism, was not a negative. It was not a negative doctrine. It was like, shouldn't do this because God says so. And the positive doctrine of classical liberalism was Christianity, at least as Locke and his contemporaries described it. So what you see Rothbard did was he secularized this Christian tradition, and he just turned it into libertarianism. And that's how, after 50, 75 years, you get the Libertarian Party.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think it's very interesting that Rothbard kind of did that because oftentimes when you look at the initial like BioShock games, those games are often thought to be a critique of Ayn Rand's version of libertarianism, objectivism, but in reality, that's not the case because Ayn Rand believed in some form of objective ethics beyond just individual self-ownership as being the only thing you have to answer to. So in reality, the BioShock games become a much more accurate critique of something like Murray Rothbard's anarcho-capitalism than objectivism, which at least has some attempts to replace God as the basis for some system of objective morals, which I think is a necessary thing to do, because if you kind of insert this relativistic notion, I don't know, I know Rothbard wasn't a relativist, but
Mm-hmm.
it's in some ways bears resemblance to that only because you're using individuals as the locus of all authority, and because of the just by the nature of what individuals choose to do with themselves, you're saying each individual has the right to do whatever they want, so as so long as they're not hurting anyone else. But in, you know, if you're only basing that off of the individuals, then it's kind of hard to justify because they're just human and they're just fallible. And the second somebody isn't able to, doesn't want to reciprocate, the second someone decides to become a sterner-eyed egoist and just take what they want for themselves, they can. And if all you have to appeal to is yourself and you're a weakling, then you're going to get your shit taken, and it's not going to be a
Mm-hmm.
fun time.
And I think the main issue with Rothbardism is it's not grounded. You know, it appears to be relativistic, but in reality, it's not grounded the way liberalism, classical liberalism, is grounded in the Christian tradition, in the Bible, and that the whole religion of Christianity. I don't know like differences between like Christianity and Catholicism. So I know some people are like actual Protestants aren't. So I'm not aware of the nuances regarding that. So excuse me in that sphere. But it was grounded in the larger Christian tradition of God and the Bible and all their things. And so it was that was like a rock upon which they could build liberalism. But for Rothbard, he did not have anything like that. He had to just create his own. It was a secular. I believe Rothbard was an atheist, and so he had to create his own secular thing. And so, when it appears to be relativistic, it's in reality just ungrounded, and it's not tied to liberalism. It's tied to like mental abstractions and men's and just ideals. They can be twisted and transformed, and they can just go to shit, really. While the classical liberal tradition, as understood as being just to God and being just to the Bible, is very different. And so, just to clarify, I'm particularly not really religious myself, but I think that it's a very positive social and cultural thing to have in a society.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely true. I think that's the other downside to libertarianism, in that it sort of embraces secularism in the same sense that the progressives do, which is that, you're free to be a heathen, when in reality, when you let people become free to be heathens, they do become heathens, and that ruins freedom
Mm-hmm.
for pretty much everyone else. The thing I like to
And yeah, that's the thing.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Well, I said that's the thing. When you would have a much more libertarian society in a Christian theocracy than you would in just some sort of like world where the Libertarian Party wins the national election. You would have because like that's from where classical liberalism is derived, is through being in accordance to the Bible and being in accordance to the Christian tradition and various ways of doing just by God.
Yeah, and that's kind of the other thing. One of the things I think that drove me to the kind of the point I am, ideologically speaking, is that kind of an appreciation of where libertarianism came from historically, and it didn't simply just spring forth as this idea that we are people born free and therefore we
Could
should
you
stay
repeat that,
free.
please? You cut out.
I'm sorry, I can't tell. I think my internet is really, really shitty, but it's one of the things that kind of drove me to where I am ideologically is the idea that libertarianism isn't the natural state of things, really. I'm not supporting something like a Hobbesian state of nature, but I don't think Locke's state of nature is quite true either, because we're really not born free in the sense that we think of freedom today. Um, when if we were in kind of the state of nature, we wouldn't necessarily all be fending for ourselves because of we're worried everybody's just going to stab us in the back, kind of like Hobbes proposes. But we're also not like Locke proposes, where we're just born and we kind of naturally tend towards a peaceful cooperation with each other in sort of this self-interested mindset. What really comes about is sort of a mix of the two, in that we're born into a sort of collective where we don't have to worry about some of our more basic needs because other people in the collective are handling it. In that someone's gathering food, someone's providing for defense, someone's organizing all this, and then later on, what happens is that you're able to then flourish as an individual a little bit more. And when the out group comes in, you can determine whether or not you're able to cooperate with them and trade more freely, and your free interaction or your free association expands as you learn to trust people. But the larger libertarian notion that libertarians have today has evolved only because we've built so much societal trust and social capital over the past centuries, as opposed to just that being how it naturally is.
Yeah, and one of the funny things about Locke's state of nature and his idea of freedom, that you're born free and the society enslaves you or whatever. It sounds the way you'll see like an Antifa or an anarcho-communist or one of those Kropotkin type people describe it is that you're born free, and then you have to be in society, and then you're quote unquote enslaved to capitalism or whatever, and you have to work for your things. It's like this primitivist sense of freedom, like, oh yeah, I don't have to do anything, so I'm just gonna like sit in this cave and pick berries, and that's gonna be my life. It's like it's a very like kind of like leftist sort of freedom, and which is why I kind of view classical liberalism in the grander sense of things as as more of like a left wing thing than like a truly right wing philosophical movement. And yeah, and so like the thing is, like, I side with Hobbes more on the state of nature, not necessarily of everyone versus everyone, but rather group versus group. So I mean it's, and I don't think Hobbes meant this either. I think it was descriptive of like the war of everyone against everyone. Because you see this, I was speaking to Tom like a couple months back. We were talking some videos doing, and we were talking about like a good model for how to describe primitive man and like pre-state man. And in my opinion, a good model would be chimpanzees. And regardless of whether or not someone like buys into evolution, I personally do. I don't want to get into something like that, but like chimpanzees act extremely similar to how man does. They're very tribal. They're social. Their social hierarchies are similar to the way man's are. They act just very similar to a primitive type man. And so what you have with chimpanzees is you have these tribes that form, and inside those tribes they develop traditions, primitive traditions like culture, and they have all these sorts of what we would call social capital, and the use of adherence to traditions and culture and etc. is to signal in-group versus out-group membership. And so chimpanzees are very tribalistic, and they'll actually go to war with other chimpanzee tribes and surround their territory and expand their territory. And so one of the things they do, I was watching this documentary about like a chimpanzee tribe, about 150 chimpanzees, and they would just go to war very militaristically. They would just like be in this line. They would creep through their enemy's territory, and then they would just ambush the chimpanzees, and they would keep on this killing and killing and killing. And the reason they're warring is to get access to new burial grounds or not nesting grounds, not burial grounds. New nesting grounds to get access to more like trees for fruit, to get access to rivers or whatever. And I think that's. And I'm not saying primitive man was exactly like chimpanzees, but I think out of any contemporary animal, that's the one which is closest to how man was in the pre-state society. So Charles Tilly, he wrote a book about state formation, and there was 5 hypotheses as to why states form, and the one he evaluated, which he felt was the most the most accurate and the most wholesome view, I guess, holistic view, was that states form to organize for war. And so, you've got these 3 chimpanzee tribes in a area. Whichever group can form a quote unquote state, whichever can organize their males in a militaristic fashion to defeat the other ones, that's the chimpanzee tribe, which will dominate that area, which will grow and carry on their offspring, carry on their lineage, while other chimpanzee tribes will die out. So, and so the ability of someone to organize people into what we call states. States originally what we perceive as states. That is the tribe which will win out the most, because primitive, in this quote unquote war of everyone against everyone, you have rents on the table. Like, there is access to this particular river, for example. That is a rent. That's an incentive on the table. There's 3 different groups. Whichever one can organize its men the best to defeat the other groups is the one that's going to win out and outcompete others. And so this sort of conflict is endemic to the human condition. And also, this sort of conflict is the reason humans are as intelligent as we are, because if we cannot outsmart and outthink and outmaneuver our enemies, we would not be where we are right now. We would be like fucking sloths hanging off of trees, like not doing anything with our life. But the fact that we are humans, the fact that we seek resources and conflict with people outside of our in-group for resources, that makes war and conflict, part of what it is to be human.
And I think this is one of the biggest death knells to like the pure Rothbardian anarcho-capitalist theory, because knowing this, that these sort of hierarchies that naturally form state-like apparatuses are endemic to the human condition, makes it such that this sort of pluralistic view of how an ANCAP society could function totally defunct, because really the methods they propose for defending themselves from outgroup attacks just wouldn't function. Now, I don't think that necessarily excludes something like the Hoppian Covenant community from working, because a lot of basic bitch ANCAPs are right in that the Hoppian ANCAP community or Covenant community is essentially a state that's not a state, but that's what you need for society to function. You need the method, some kind of formal method, to organize and defend a specific set of territory. You can't just have the roving kind of various defense corps to collectively defend people who aren't bound by anything. They have to be bound by some kind of common law or common rule. And I mean, the way I guess you'd still distinguish it as anarcho-capitalist in the sense is that, supposedly you'll get everybody's consent within the society to operate this way, one way or another, sometimes through physically removing those who don't comply by putting social pressure on them and economic pressure and things like that. Or, maybe you just happen to find a group that's naturally cohesive. But either way, I think there's if you're an ANCAP who's not entertaining the Hoppian notion of social organization, you're just wrong.
Yeah, well, I mean, the thing with the Hoppian covenant community is that that's what an absolute monarchy looks like, is where the king is the owner of the entire country. And so we can look at this as Saudi Arabia, like the House of Al Saud. I think it was like their grandfather, their great grandfather, some guy in the early 20th century of the House of Al Saud. He conquered all those like desert tribes, and so like the entire name Saudi Arabia. It's like Al Saud's Arabia. It's like it belongs to him, and so like that's like pretty much what a covenant community would end up as. It would just end up as that. So I just kind of save myself the mental masturbations of those Hoppian rationalists who just like to be like, oh, well, in a libertarian society, we would operate in covenant. It's just like, just save like a bunch of effort and just be like an absolutist, which is what more or less I am. And that's because that's what it would end up being anyway. And so,
well, I think
we're just like the king owns it.
Yeah, I think that's what you definitely need, that sort of absolutism. Like, I think one of the dudes from Liberty Hangout tweeted out something to the effect of, libertarianism is the ultimate form of authoritarianism, because you have ultimate authority over everything that is your property, and you can do whatever you want with it, which I think is, pretty accurate. And I think that's what it has to be.
Well, but yeah, like what we define as property, like what a human, like what a normal person would have, is more of like a lease. Like the actual property, like the real property, is owned by the sovereign. Or that's like, it has a much more, and he just like leases it out to you, and we call it property. And so it's just, and I just feel like that's just how any sort of vaguely Hoppian covenant community would operate. And if you listen to, I listen to Radical and Cantwell, and it's funny watching his development, because he went from just like anarcho-capitalist, a Trump guy, to more hardcore on the Hoppa stuff, and then now he's talked about the logistics of buying up his hundreds of acres, and he wants people to move over there who have been doxxed and run businesses, and he was like, one of the things we have to do is respect each other's monopolies, so that we can advance against our enemies. And the thing which that really reminded me of was in Rothbard's book For a New Liberty. Murray Rothbard spoke about absolutism, and he was spoken about how these divine right kings would give favored people monopolies, like guilds. They would be like the blacksmiths guild. You get your monopoly. You can only be the only one to operate a blacksmith, and this and that. And I think it's just so funny watching Cantwell go from like this Hoppa guy to basically like just an absolute European king. And it's just, and I'm not saying he is that, but like in his thought process, he's just like, oh yeah, I see why I want to do that. We want to privilege some of our groups so that we can compete and make a good industry and this and that. And so, I just think Hoppianism is just it's basically just absolutism with a little bit more of mental masturbation.
Yeah, no, I'm there with you. I'm happy since the last time we've talked that he's actually been freed from jail, so we actually get to listen to new episodes of the Radical Agenda again.
Dude, I'm ass deep in the Radical Agenda. Like, I've more than I can even listen to.
I'm so happy he's doing shit with like Anglin now. That shit's so funny.
That's hilarious. I love that.
But anyway, we've been going on this about this for about 30 minutes now, and that's the stuff we pretty much are set on. I think the other thing I wanted to discuss with you though was some stuff we've kind of sparred over in the Discord and in Twitter and Insta a little bit, and that is the notion. We could start broad. I'll start with just the topic of free trade first, because I think it's something that brings up a lot of logistics and there's a lot of options to it. But now I'm not autistically into free trade and the idea that we should just be, buying cheap goods from wherever because, it's just cheap. Therefore, we should buy it and, sell all our own steel manufacturers down the road. Like, no, China's fucking with their steel prices and making it possible for it to be sold at incredibly like sub-market rate levels or sub market rate prices. Like, slap a tariff on that thing for sure. and to make it
Yeah.
so that American steel manufacturers can produce again. The one thing I have a problem with, though, is if you go a little bit too far with it and it becomes tariffs on so many things for the sake of stimulating American employment, which has, in my mind, a lot of negative consequences. One being that the cheap goods that we do sell over here, that we do get from other countries, enable more people to be employed here, because when people, either when businesses save money on intermediary goods, or
Hmm.
consumer, they can save it for themselves and hire more people. Or when consumers save more money on just consumer goods, they can then spend more of it at other businesses and thus promote employment in those areas as well. So, I mean, there's certainly places where obvious manipulation is taking place that tariffs could help balance that out.
Hmm.
But I don't think the broad application of tariffs would be good for the American economy and thereby, national stability.
And neither do I, and neither do the technicians, which are actually managing the economy. So one of the things one of the recent things that happened was Trump puts tariffs on Chinese solar panels and dishwashers. I didn't get to look in no, not the dishwashers, laundry machines. I
Yeah.
didn't get to look in the laundry machine area, but I definitely looked into the solar industry and what that meant. And so what China has been doing is they have been giving consumer tax credits for people who buy. They've been giving income tax credits, I believe, or tax credits for people who buy solar panels. So they've been getting a lot of it, and so a big long-term goal of China is to have a lot of just to go 80% solar by 2050, which I think is a good idea. They changed denialists, and I don't think coal is like a good thing. Like coal creates so much fucking smog that you can't even breathe in your city. And I think it's a good move, and it's like a good move by China to kind of spur people moving over to solar over coal, because that's what they use, and they use coal, and that's just like really bad. So they've been so for their consumers, solar is very cheap, and the cost of solar is not proportional to the efficiency of solar panels and the efficiency of solar technology. So their entire solar industry, their solar producing industry, gets this sort of subsidy in that prices for the consumer are skewed. And so the U.S. also has been trying to do this inside the U.S. They've been trying to get more onto solar, and so U.S. has invested billions and billions of dollars to spur U.S. Solar. And so what China is doing is their super cheap solar is just going all over the world, and it is disrupting industries. And the root cause of this was the Chinese tax credits to consumer solar, and quote unquote unjustly by judge of the market. They have unjustly enriched their solar manufacturers without them offering a more efficient energy means than they're currently available on coal. And so, in that light, what Trump did was he was like, all right, we're going to put a tariff on this. China's freaking out about it. They're saying, let's go to the World Trade Organization. They threatened to file a complaint with the World Trade Organization, but one of the good things about a lot of these globalist institutions is that they're basically like controlled by the U.S., or they give like a lot of deference to the U.S., like the United
Yeah.
Nations. It's like it's in New York City. The World Trade Organization, that's the International Monetary Fund. A lot of them, the U.S. has heavy influence on all of them.
Yeah.
So this sort of like imperialistic globalist thing the U.S. does, it gives them power over people, rising powers like China. So
Yeah. And I
even
think one of
through
the
that,
things that you noted is that, because China's going all over the world with this stuff, and they're artificially making the price way over competitive. Like I said, I don't have a problem with friggin' tariffing that, just so that we actually have the competitive edge again. At the same time, I'd say the problem I have with us, say, like I think we saw with the Obama administration, that just the pure subsidization of these types of industries isn't enough to actually get them afloat. I think there are only
mm-hmm.
certain instances where funding a positive externality, as you might say, is going to reap greater benefits than just letting the market handle it. And so I think the better way to incentivize this type of thing, as opposed to just straight subsidization, is I think you said China was doing this too, but like giving the tax credits and things like that, making it so that if you are moving towards clean energy, which I think, I have no allegiance to coal. I just want what's going to give us the cheapest energy. I think if we can sort of promote clean energy and, do some environmental good, that's not a bad thing. But I think it's best to promote that through, deregulation and market incentives as opposed to just throwing money at the problem.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where China has done better than the U.S. because one of the things the U.S. would do is they would give loans to a lot of these solar industries and a lot of solar companies, and a lot of them just like went bankrupt. And I really agree with you of just finding more like, or just like more market-based solutions to these sort of problems. And when I say I'm like, and so I'm just not like a completely full-on free trade guy, and like not really any professional economist is. But I mean, the thing is that like, so when I'm like kind of counter signal laissez-faire free trade, I'm talking about the nuances such as Chinese steel, Chinese solar panels, and all these sorts of things. So, and I mean, I feel like the economic establishment of the U.S. government is around the same line because if you see, like, if you like in those polls of economists, like the thing they agree on the most is that 93% of them, 94% agree that mostly free trade is the way to go. And so, they all agree on that. But there are these little subtleties and nuances which need to be addressed, which are not that, which don't make the best sound bites, which is why when you democratize these sort of things, when you make these sort of campaign promises, it's terrible. And when you have like the Joe Sixpack, who's like a fucking plumber, and he's saying like, you know what, I think we need to put a 22.5% tariff on Chinese steel. It's like, why would he know that? There's no reason for him to know that. I don't expect him to know that. And I don't want him to be one of those like single issue voters that empowers someone based on that belief. And so this is one of the reasons I'm very anti-democratic, because this, like, the study of economics, are like, there's very niche areas of economics like health, labor, energy economics. There's all sorts of things, and these need to be ran by technicians, and a lot of these technicians are they do PhDs, like, they've read, as the fucking libertarians try to say, they've taken Econ 101, so to speak. But and I mean, they're experts in these fields, and I want to defer to their authority rather than to have Trump be like, oh, I'm going to make America great again by tariffs, and then have the New York Times be like, oh, actually, free trade is good, and then have this just like little media, this like little back and forth, this like social conflict over tariffs and this and that, when really it's in none of these people's purview what exactly tariffs should be and how they can be accomplished. And it's just like, I'm just like, this needs to be removed from the public discourse, basically.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. I'm against, like we said before, I'm against the democratization of any kind of issue that's so technical as this. The only thing I kind of take issue with, and I'm going to be a bit nitpicky here, is when you say we need technicians to run the economy. I still have those kind of ANCAP tendencies where I'd prefer it if there weren't a central bank or these technicians that needed to run the economy. Although, as is now, we do need them to some extent. But my fear is that to some extent, these technicians are leaning to a specific side, and so the information that they're getting, while some of it might be good, like obviously somebody like a Joseph Stiglitz or Manicue is doing good work. And I've been reading, not Stiglitz, I've been reading Bernanke and Manicue just a little bit recently, and they do good research, obviously, but there's still very clearly some sort of ideological bias to a certain extent. And so we just have to watch that and be careful with that. Because, I mean, I like the idea of people who know what they're talking about running things. But if all those people happen to come from the same school with the exact same ideas on how to run things, it just makes me a little bit suspicious and a little bit nervous and such.
Well, it's like two things. So first, when I mean run the economy, and in general, what I mean rule. What rulers really do is they set up the incentives of society in such a way so that the cheapest option for people to do is what is like quote unquote the right thing to do. So they set up the incentives of society so that when you walk into the gas station, it is very expensive for you to steal a candy bar because you'll go to jail, get a felony, all of this thing. And so when I say when I say they run the economy, I mean they manage these sort of like boundaries as to what's acceptable, what's not, what's a quote unquote fair business practice, what's not, what is in the long term interests of the polity and what is not. And so, and so I know what you mean when run the economy, like not like some Soviet commissar, but
Right,
just
right.
like set the boundaries, and set the boundaries and everything inside of that. That's like the market operating, and I feel like that's the dominant um, school of thought of a lot of professional economists. And then additionally, about your second point about guys like Krugman and Stiglitz, actually, I'm pretty sure that was the guy who was like shilling for Venezuela back in 2011. So
Yeah,
fuck
yeah, I
that
think that
guy.
was Stiglitz. That's
Yeah, and so like, well, which is part of back on the economy, the ideological bent. This is what I used to view a lot of when I was an ANCAP of all. This is just the state doing this. I've come to appreciate that I've come to understand that a lot of what we see is just like purely the goals of the state, of the operation of the state, is really just a product of democracy, a necessary product of democracy. One example of, and so what you'll see is that instead of using policy tools to promote, to run the country the best, they will use policy tools as a political weapon to bludgeon their enemies. So one of the things which you and your listeners are probably the most familiar with is immigration policy. And so instead of Elizabeth Warren and all these lefty and Nancy Pelosi saying, like we really need to bring in some temporary visas so they can pick our thing and then make sure they leave. They're like, no, we need to open the floodgates because we know 80% of these people will vote Democrat, and if we let in 2, 3, 4 million illegal immigrants, legalize and give amnesty to every illegal immigrant in here, we can flip Texas, flip Florida, flip all these like solid red states, and make the United States into a one-party state. So issues of policy devolve in a democracy. Tools of policy become political weapons, and so in a democracy, it is a very much a war of everyone against everyone. When the population loses the degree of homogeneity, when the population becomes more heterogeneous, it becomes a war of everyone against everyone because there are many divergent interests that are cooperating under one system, and then they just go to war with each other. They do it through nation, they'll do it through trade. Trump. There's some like Google is sort of like not an enemy, but like they're kind of subversive towards like U.S. nationalism. Maybe
yeah.
Trump is like, okay, I'm going to end your H-1B visas. You can't have any till we can Google, and it's a policy tool, like it's an immigration policy tool, in a matter of getting labor to where it's needed. In the national economy, but Trump would only do it just to weaken his enemy, which is Google. And so, in this sort of democracy, you get this just war of everyone against everyone, and policy tools turn into a weapon to just beat the shit out of your enemies with.
Yeah, yeah, that's very true. Democracy becomes a war of all against all, more so than anything that and than any state of nature like Hobbes proposed, because it's the great equalizer where people aren't really equal.
Yeah,
And I see
and
now. Sorry, go ahead.
go ahead.
Well, I was going to kind of relate this to the idea of what we were talking about earlier. This is kind of a non sequitur, but I did want to bring up the idea because we mentioned it of government of you kind of brought it up in that rulers setting limits so that it is always cheapest to go with the best option possible.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess this sort of rang up in my mind what we were talking about a little bit in the Discord last night, which was the funding of certain positive externalities because they have larger net benefits.
Yeah.
Now, I don't disagree with the notion entirely that there are certain things that just need to be funded right now, like especially when it comes to defense. I haven't read. Hoppe has like a collection of essays that he's edited, known as "The Myth of National Defense," and I haven't read that yet.
Yeah.
So I can't like say if oh well, I can't list off reasons. Oh, this, and this would make
Yeah.
private defense better. But I do think there is a case specifically to what we were talking about last night, where you could say that privatized education, as much as education in general, is a positive externality, and when people are educated, it's just better for everyone in general. I
Mhm.
think it would be far more better if it were just left to, say, a private institution. Because one of the things that was brought to my attention by someone else in the Discord who gave me like their little take on our conversation was that when you look at a country like Japan with its cultural homogeneity, only middle school is required up until only you're only required to have an education up until the eighth grade, and then secondary school, as they would call it, is optional. And from there, it's all pretty much privatized, and the graduation rate is 98% because only the people who really want it go there. And so I think that kind of there is. I think there's a couple different aspects to it. I'm gonna ignore like the cultural homogeneity part for it now because I don't think it's relevant to what we're talking about. But
Mhm.
I think the idea of letting positive externalities be attained. I think the idea of letting people attain the most benefit possible from positive externalities themselves, as
Mhm.
opposed to kind of trying to force the benefits of positive externalities on the populace at large, is just
Mhm.
a more effective way of doing it than having government subsidize it.
Well, so Japan actually does subsidize education. I just pulled it up. They spend
To a certain extent, yeah.
$17 billion, and so I mean, like, it's the operation is done by private people. So I mean, I like charter schools. I'm personally a proponent of charter schools. But the thing with charter schools is they still get the subsidy, so that um, inner city kids and poor children and kids in rural areas, they can go to better schools. And so funding positive externalities does not always just come in the form of having a government run school. They could they could also fund positive externalities by having a charter system, a charter school system. And so I mean, that's where I was going into it. And so what I was trying to show yesterday through the financial, like the net present value, everything, that even if
Yeah.
we do spend $12,000 a year for 12 years, the difference between a high school dropout and a high school graduate in income is $10,000. So I mean, assuming so what I and so calculating the and so even like I did like a little calculation on that, and I mean even that it increases the quote unquote net worth of society by $50,000,
Hmm.
just based on a high school student. And so I mean we can get into that if you want for a sec.
No, sure. I'm not. I wasn't. I'm not well equipped enough, honestly, to get into the
Yeah.
specific maths. Like, what we were when I was doing the last time we were talking about present value and specifically like bank finances and shit like that was like when I was taking Calc 1 and we just happened to go over some
Oh, okay.
financial aspects. So I haven't gone over that stuff in a while. But my point in this conversation would kind of be just speaking more broadly, rather than doing the thing where we subsidize something and use taxpayer funded money. I think we could also pull the same incentives like we do with solar panels, where rather than just subsidizing something, we could also say charter schools just don't pay any taxes
Mm-hmm.
and give out tax breaks to charter schools as opposed to just throwing money at them. Because I think when you throw money at something, and I say throw money at something, I know we're not throwing money at something, but I think I'm just using it as the analogy. But when you
Yeah.
subsidize something, there always tends to be more of a wastefulness because so long as the income stream is guaranteed, people are willing to either be a little bit more risky and potentially go bankrupt in
Mm-hmm.
the process because they think they'll have that guaranteed income stream, or they'll just get complacent and will decide not to improve because they still have the income stream.
Mm-hmm.
So I think just the better solution in terms of risk and balancing the potential risk with the benefit of the positive externality. I think just allowing let's just say, again, we just give them tax credits or tax breaks is better than is more effective than the potential risks of subsidization.
Yeah, well, yeah, and so to add to that, I mean, my general point is what we spoke about yesterday was that when you subsidize something, or it was like, so when you're subsidizing education, you're targeting like the bottom 25% of your country, because
Right.
I already know that the middle class to upper class, they're going to do all right because they have, if like, let's say I'm the king, right? And I know my middle class, upper class, they're going to do all right because they're capable enough to get there. But I need to look at my lowest people in my society and make sure that if I can do something that will improve their standing or make them less prone to violence or all these other types of to contain their negative habits, then I mean that's something worthwhile doing. And so one of the things that charter schools are really good at is that you still have a sort of competitive market in that charter schools have to compete against one another in order to win the subsidy. So it's not like it's different from it's similar to a public school in that there's public funding, a government run school, but it's different in that you can take that subsidy and go elsewhere. So the consumer has a lot of buying power and the consumer has bargaining power. And so that pressure is designed to make charter schools compete against one another and make sure that they're offering that better education in pursuit of that juicy subsidy that the government provides them. And I believe the government provides charter schools with about 7,000 a year, whereas on average, whereas the Department of Education currently spends 12,000 per year in a public school. So they actually get a little bit less, and they can do about the same or a little bit better with less money. So in that sense, charter schools are good. So charter schools very like strong. It's like and so another one of these things is that we will and not just in terms of government, but libertarians will point the failings of government a lot is that we are learning as we go. So we will. And so we see what works, we see what doesn't work. This is a process. We now know from Seattle's like with the minimum wage thing, we now know not to raise your minimum wage so rapidly because we have all the data and we know exactly what happens. I mean, everyone else was saying, like everyone with sense, like this is retarded, just without even we know a priori that this is gonna be shit because you're just increasing it so fast and it's just going to hurt your bottom line for your people. And but I mean like that getting like once we've seen that, it's like now and like we know for sure that such rapid minimum wage increases are not good. And so I mean under democracy there's a lot of political pressures to offer these sort of gifts to the populace. Because it's just like you have Bernie Sanders, his entire like campaign was centered around him giving free things to his voters. And like a bunch of his voters were millennials, they had college debt, they had all this thing. That was like the biggest conflict of interest in voting I have ever seen, like because when you have like 100K of college debt and you're about to go vote and Bernie Sanders is like, oh, you should vote for me, I'll run the country best. When we think of conflict of interest, we think of like a government official in some prominent office. But I mean, the same thing could apply to a voter too. It's like there's a conflict of interest if we're going to accept the liberal bullshit of, the democracy is really great and you got to do your duty as a citizen. You doing your duty as a citizen, there's a massive conflict of interest between you voting for Bernie Sanders or you picking the quote unquote sensible person to do the best for your country.
Yeah, it's like what's best for you as opposed to what might actually be best. And I think there was a quote going around, I forget who said it. It was somebody during the French Revolution. It was a French royalist who said that the trouble with one of the reasons they opposed democracy was that it allows objective evil to be run against objective good as a viable alternative. And like, that's going to be a shitty system because if you're just allowing objective evil to win because of mass vote, then you're going to get that. But to get back to your point that you made a little bit earlier about using this kind of program to sort of socially contain the lower rungs of society. I think in the U.S. we certainly have to worry about that only because we're so divided along so many lines, not just economic, but cultural and racial as well. But
Mm-hmm.
I think in homogenous societies somewhat, you don't have to worry about that to the same extent because there is somewhat of a understanding within that culture that there's going to be a way to naturally get to the top through other means, and that your place on the bottom isn't a matter of oppression, but just that, that's just how it is. And I think that's how it was often looked at throughout society until, as Jordan Peterson might put it, the cabal of radical Marxists took over universities and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think, if we are, of course this is somewhat utopian, but if we were in a completely, if we were still even a supermajority white nation with a lower class that was still largely white, I don't think we'd have to worry so much about this rampant narrative of capitalism being this great oppressor. And so I don't think it'd be necessary to the same extent to worry about socially containing these lower classes. Although I see the use for it in the context of the modern United States, at least, and how divided we are.
Well, but I mean, whether your lower class is a different ethnic group that has a very different IQ bell curve than yours, or whether you're in 100% white country like Sweden was before they got all cucked. Your lower classes, they're still the ones, Sweden's average IQ is 100. They're like low rung people are going to be like 70 to 85 IQ people. And that is the area, especially the 80s. The 80s is where it's extremely bad for criminality because that's where you're functional enough to be in society, but you're low IQ enough that you don't think ahead, so you're very prone to criminality and
Your
violence and
super
all
high
this
time
sort of thing.
preference, essentially.
Yeah, you're just a you're high time preference and I was gonna say yeah, but and so even in Sweden, like all white Sweden, you gotta do something about the small percent of 70 to 85 IQ Swedens because that populace is going to it's going to be a problem for you. And one of the nice things about like super homogenous countries like Sweden and Norway is that there's high trust. So when you give out welfare, you don't. It's like when the government gives out welfare, you don't view anything wrong with it because you're like, these are my kin, these are my people. I mean, I trust them, I know them, I know they will, and you have a connection to the state and to the people around you than you do in some multiculti hellhole like New York City. And so you'll also see a lot more resentment against welfare in heterogeneous places like the US, where you have a more productive class, which just rightfully views themselves as subsidizing a foreign outgroup lower class. And that sort of thing just doesn't exist in a homogenous state like the Scandinavian countries, and it's a completely different dynamic. And it's just the way their government does things is received very differently over there.
Yeah, no, of course. In the high trust societies that like that, you obviously feel that connection to the state. And
Mm-hmm.
I think, yeah, like Japan and Sweden and, even still some of the European nations, because they are majority white, have been able to last this long on sort of nanny state systems. But
Yeah.
I think what I would still say to that is that you can have that connection with your kin around you, and you can still have that sort of charitable system in place without having the mechanism of that charity being the government. Because I think one of the examples I like to cite a lot is the lodge practice, which is a type of healthcare system that was present in the United States up until right before the Great Depression, essentially. And what lodge practice is a system where if you were in a certain trade lodge, not necessarily a union, but a lodge,
Mm-hmm.
and it was sort of low skill, you would pay your lodge dues. And
Yeah.
if you ever got sick, you could take out of like the pot and you could go see a doctor at no expense to you because you'd pay your dues and everybody else paid their dues. So it was okay if somebody took out of the pot every now and again, and it made competition for doctors very high, so the prices of medical care dropped as well. And it was a very effective system, and it was all essentially privately run. It was
Mm-hmm.
privatized collective action, essentially. And Catholic hospitals used to operate kind of on that same basis, although they took from the collection of Catholic parishes around
Yeah.
them more so than that general thing. And so what I'd like to see eventually is, while certain forms of welfare are certainly useful at the moment just because it's socially necessary, I think we can get to a point of high trust again, or cultural homogeneity, one or the other, or, well, both really, because you need one for the other. And I think we can see that point again, and we can sort of remove the state from the apparatus of charity, or handouts or anything like that.
Well, I think you're better off getting to that ideal just by eugenicizing all the low IQ people, so that within 100 years, no one will need welfare because everyone will have a low enough time preference. They'll be responsible enough and be in control of their urges enough that even the lowest members of society will be what we today view as middle class.
Mm.
And I mean, I just feel like so I mean, like in in a in a in like a more absolutist state, you can do a lot more of that because you don't have these sort of like dysgenic democratic pressures. So, like right now, if I was a senator and I was like, oh, I'm going to introduce this bill of sterilization in exchange for food stamps, like that would not
Yeah.
fly.
Yeah.
That would
That
not
wouldn't, no,
fly.
it wouldn't.
But if the king of Saudi Arabia is like, okay, yeah, if you collect food stamps for longer than 6 months, you're gonna get sterilized. It doesn't matter because no one can vote, and like it literally doesn't. Well, I mean, it matters what the people think, so long as they still cooperate. But I mean, he can do a lot more drastic measures and a lot more corrective measures of
Well, I
problematic
think,
areas.
yeah, well, I agree with the general premise of what you're saying,
Mm-hmm.
but I would say that just as a Catholic, I have some moral quandaries with eugenics. But I think we could kind of replicate what England did prior to their rise to power, which was, well, they didn't have eugenics back then, but what they did, which essentially allowed them to depopulate their lower classes
Mm-hmm.
and essentially become a dominantly middle and upper class society, was they executed essentially the
Yeah.
bottom 1.5% of men, like for like 40 some years or so,
Mm-hmm.
through like just criminal charges, like the punishments
No, they did that for centuries.
for centuries. Yeah, you're right. I'm
Yeah.
sorry, I wasn't. But I think you've heard this example. Do you listen to the Alternative Hypothesis YouTube channel at all?
No, I just read the paper.
Yeah. Well, okay. So, well, you know what I'm referencing.
Yeah.
The Alternative Hypothesis is the guy who he references it a lot in his videos. But of course, you continue to do something like that, and we essentially end up with the same result you're talking about as well. In what I would argue is a somewhat less morally dubious fashion.
Well, I
But
mean, when I say eugenics, a lot of it is just me being just out there. But I mean, like, there's a lot of like, there's the eugenics of what we colloquially deem the free market. Like, if you
sure.
are a unruly, shitty person with bad manners, you are not going to get a job. And because you're not going to get a job, you're not going to get a mate, and you're not going to have kids, and your genes are going to die out. That is a eugenics. Like when people throw around the word eugenics, they think of like Dr. Mengele in like Auschwitz, like doing experiments on you. But it's like a very like it's a very like it has a lot of negative connotations attached to it, but which I would think which I would say are dishonestly attached to it. But I mean, the general like nature of eugenics is structuring your society so that the worst amongst you do not spread their seed, and that the best amongst you spread their seed the most.
Mm.
And so that's like generally what eugenics is. I don't mean like some sort of like Nazi scientist shit.
Mm. Yeah, I think I think that has to be what's done to some extent, because I think that's what needs to be achieved in order for some level of societal trust uh, to be returned
Mm-hmm.
at one rate or another.
Yeah.
And I just don't think at the especially with this mass democratization, as Hoppe pointed out, it's just been a decivilization process, and
Yeah.
we've continued to breed people who are just incredibly high time preference, and probably I think you could probably find some level of correlation between low IQ and high time preference, although
There'd
the
be a huge
sociological.
correlation.
Yeah, I think I'm sure you could find it just by looking at a few papers, but I doubt you'll ever find anybody to actually just do the research themselves and formalize it in this single paper. But
Yeah.
I'm sure it's out there.
I mean, those are some things where we don't even need empiricism for. Like, we know because, well, first off, like, in order to save, you need to be capable of earning an income beyond your expenses. And
Mm.
if you have an IQ of 80, like, you're not doing that. So it's
Yeah,
a very different. So, but I mean, like, we don't even need this is like one of those things we can just figure out a priori. Is that probably pretty strong correlation there? But
yeah,
yeah.
and I think that's one of the things that when SJWs kind of, or progressives in general, kind of point out that a meritocratic system would inherently benefit people who were
White.
white. Yeah, I mean that's not necessarily wrong, because that's a group of people who have a much higher IQ bell curve and are therefore going to do much better than other certain groups of people. That doesn't
Yeah.
mean it's a matter of oppression or anything. That's just how it's going to be. And so there is a sort of eugenics inherent in the free market almost.
Yeah, and I mean, it's not necessarily like state imposed. It's rather, it's more descriptive of a social order or state of being where these sort of pressures are applied. Like evolution is eugenic. Like
Hmm.
that's natural selection is eugenic. Like that's how like things work. It's the nature of the world. And for you to subsidize the worst amongst us and tax the highest, the best amongst us, that's dysgenic. That's the opposite of eugenics. And so what you want to do is you want to just turn that around. But I mean, like, yeah, like I said, like back to public schools is like, one of the things which has really changed my thinking is I stopped thinking about like an ideal world or like I saw building these just like rationalist like models of like, oh, in the state of nature, I own myself, and for a new liberty, Murray Rothbard does this for like half the book. He's like, oh, so if you can go pick up an apple and then that apple is yours, and he just does that. And I'm like, well, so the way I think now is like, well, where am I? I'm in the United States. This is the what's it called? Population distribution. This is the type of people we have here. This is what we have. What can I do to go from where we are right now into an incrementally better world? And from there, when you deal with things like that, your thinking becomes a lot clearer. The friction between this sort of like libertarian model and reality that I know you've probably experienced. Pretty much a lot of libertarians, any honest libertarian has experienced this friction I'm speaking about between their model of the world and reality.
Mm.
That just disappears and just things become so much simpler. And it's just so much easier to navigate the world and see what needs to be done to get to a incrementally better end. And I just feel like it's sort of it's there is some use to it, but it's largely a waste of time to stipulate the way Locke and Rothbard and Hoppe do about some sort of like ideal state and how that works rather than I mean it's important to have ideals that we move towards, but I just think we need to not spend as much time in the realm of those ideals, and we should spend a lot more time in the realm of the here and now with our current situation and our variables and our problems and potential solutions.
Yeah, I think definitely libertarians deal with ideals far too much, and I think that's one of the big downsides to just the movement in general.
Yeah,
And yeah, um,
it's not pragmatic.
no, no, it is not.
Yeah,
um,
it's just like it's funny just like now that like I've moved past libertarianism for a while now, like I seem like you're kind of like ditching just ontological like liberalism and just not ditching but just like you're seeing the merits of other schools of thought and other views of the world, and it just becomes a lot easier
yeah,
like
I
to
mean,
navigate the world, a lot less just annoyance.
yeah, I think I've described myself as a political Rorschach test for like a while now, and it's bit yeah. I mean, I the only accurate label I've been able to give myself as of recent has only been, uh, I'm just right wing in
Yeah,
general, whatever that means.
yeah.
And so, I mean, I have an idea of what it means, but people could look at me and say, "Oh, you're a fascist" or whatever. And I know that's probably not an accurate label, but I mean, I haven't read anything about fascism, so I wouldn't know. I can't say I haven't done enough reading on the broad theories of political thought that might be considered right wing in order to say what I am or am not. I just know I'm broadly right wing with sort of libertarian underlying philosophies.
Hmm. Well, yeah, you appreciate the market, kind of. It's just like you have an appreciation for how it works. Whereas you have other quote unquote right wing people like the Traditionalist Workers Party. I don't know if you're
Oh God,
familiar with them. Matt Heimbach.
fuck
Matt
Matt
Heimbach
Heimbach and
seems
his
like a good
larping
guy,
ass.
but he seems like a nice guy. But man, that fucking Strasserism that's a hell of a drug. Like the Strasserists, for the sake of your audience, were the sort of like left wing part of the Nazis. The Nazis were just generally like, so when Hitler said we're National Socialists, everyone was talking about socialism, communism. They were huge in Nazi Germany, and Hitler said, "Okay, if we must be socialists, let's be National Socialists." And so when he made the Nazi color red, he stole that from the communists, and he wrote that in his book Mein Kampf. He was like, on the problem with the Reds or whatever that was called, that chapter. He was like, he just did that to piss them off, and he just took the name National Socialism, and it just drove them insane. And he was just like having a laugh. And so like the Strasserists, they were like the actual like National Socialists. They spoke a lot about like alienation and exploitation and all this like commie bullshit. And so on the night of the Long Knives, after Hitler took power, they just killed, I think, about 120 high-ranking Strasserists and just purged them from the party. And that's kind of how that same ideology I see in the Traditionalist Workers Party. But someone like you who's more right wing, who's
I I don't like Heimbach and the Nationalist Workers Party for a lot of reasons, none the least of which they go along the lines of if you're worried about how things look IRL, then you're an optics cuck. And like
yeah,
they were at that what was that event in Tennessee or whatever that they were at? Do you know what I'm talking about?
I think so. I heard Canwell talk about it.
Yeah, and it's like I think he was still in prison at that time, but he
Mm-hmm.
probably heard about it just through the grapevine. But it was like people like James Alsop and Braving Ruin were talking about it, and it's just like the type of rallies they were doing with like actual Nazi flags and
Yeah,
shit like that. It's just not good to get like you can have nationalist sentiments and
that's just
want
LARPing.
to advance the cause, but like whatchamacallit, you can't go out and do that type of shit. That's going to turn people off, and it's not good for any like traditionalist or nationalist movement that you're trying to get off the ground. It's just not.
Well, yeah, especially using like these Nazi Germanic aesthetics, they don't mix with like the American psyche, with like the
Mm.
average American. It's one thing if some like neat is like, oh yeah, look at all these swastikas, they're so cool, I'm so edgy, like I matter now, I have a purpose, I'm like the guy people pay attention to because I have a swastika. It's one thing for him, but like the average American, he sees these Germanic aesthetics, these swastikas, these emblems of what was America's enemy, and regardless of your opinions on World War II, that just people don't buy into that. The purpose of aesthetics is to make people appreciate beauty and to kind of inspire them and instill in them a sense of awe. So when the Nazis would create like the plans for their huge like Reichshall, I don't remember what it was called, like the big dome where they were going to have their parliament or
Yeah, yeah,
whatever.
yeah. I know what you're talking
That
about.
they made those so huge, and the aesthetics of the Nazi Reich were to inspire people in the sense of awe, that they were like, we built this, like our country built this, like, and so it gives them this sense of like they're part of something else. So there's a lot more to aesthetics than just like what looks cool. It's like it inspires people, and it gives them an appreciation for beauty, and it does so much like psychological, emotional things to people. And for you to just fly around Nazi flags in 2018 America, it's like that is just extremely obtuse and completely out of line with the sensibilities of the American man.
Definitely. I think that was a good little side tangent to end on. What about
Yeah,
you?
yeah, I think so.
All
Yeah, it was
right,
great
cool.
being on again. It's always good talking to you.
You too. You too. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, no problem.
All right.
All right.
Everybody, thanks for watching. Thanks for stopping by, and see you around next time.
All right, see you.
Peace.